As he had promised, the old man right away began his survey of the lands granted to the Negroes, assisted sometimes by me or Lyman, but increasingly accompanied by the bearded fellow we had met on our first visit to Timbuktu, their unofficial chieftain and an altogether admirable gentleman. Eldon Fleet was a freedman from Brooklyn, New York. He had been a printer and for many years had edited and published an abolitionist newspaper, the Gileadite, which circulated mainly among Negroes in Brooklyn and New York City. Father had high regard for Mr. Fleet's general intelligence and character. They both recognized the need to make a proper survey of the freedmen's lands, and they agreed on the usefulness of establishing Timbuktu as an actively operating station on the Underground Railroad. They knew that the routes in the east along the Hudson and Champlain valleys and in the west into Ontario by way of Niagara and Detroit were becoming increasingly dangerous and subject to attack by pro-slavery people residing along the lines and by kidnappers hired by Southern slaveholders. "We've got to head up into the hills and move across the ridges and peaks where we cannot be pursued," the old man had decided. Also, he had long wished anyhow to establish an escape route for the slaves which would be protected, not by well-meaning whites, but by heavily armed black men. He believed that only when the Negroes themselves were able to threaten the slavers with deadly force would the cost of the peculiar institution become so great as to crumble of its own weight. It was from these residents of Timbuktu that he believed he would draw his initial cadre of armed black men. Thus, with Mr. Fleet at his side, Father, at the first opportunity, hiked the long way south to Indian Pass on to the tiny village of Tawas. In that isolated place was a family named Wilkinson, known to Father and Mr. Fleet as dedicated and trustworthy abolitionists. Mr. Fleet and Father arranged to have Mr. Wilkinson notify them whenever cargo sent from the south for transshipment north arrived at his home. He was to send one of his sons through the woods to our place, and then Father and I, Mr. Fleet and Lyman Epps, carrying rifles as if on a hunt, would go back with the boy, retrieve the cargo, and under cover of darkness transport it back to North Elba, where as soon as possible we would move it north by wagon to the next transshipping point, which at that time was Port Kent on Lake Champlain, a mere 40 miles south of the Canadian border. Late one bright afternoon in early June, Mr. Wilkinson's young son, Daniel, appeared at our farm bearing the information that cargo had arrived in Tawas. It was nearly dusk before we foregathered at the house and then, with considerable excitement, struck out for Tawas, a good 8 hours' hike away. The boy told us that a Negro man and his wife, both in somewhat debilitated condition, had arrived the previous night. They had been forwarded by Frederick Douglass himself, and there was a considerable reward for their return, he added as a warning, for he knew that this fact increased the danger of transporting them. For Mr. Fleet, this was a great opportunity. Without the material support and protection of the old man, he had up to now been limited to only the most passive of roles in aiding the escapes of his enslaved brethren. It was nearly dawn when we finally exited from the woods south of Indian Pass and approached the mines and furnaces of Tawas. The village was made up mostly of shanties for the Irish miners, which, in their sad disarray and impoverishment, reminded me of Timbuktu, and as we passed by we could see the miners emerging from their cold, damp hovels. They barely looked up at us as we passed, so borne down by their labors were they. We made our way along the muddy track that ran through the encampment. When we reached the further edge, we saw ahead of us a proper house with a porch and an attached barn, the home of the supervisor of the mines. Mr. Jonas Wilkinson. Mr. Wilkinson told us they run off to a surprising degree, the Irish, though they got nothing to run to except back to the wharfs of Boston or New York. They are a sad lot, ignorant and quarrelsome and addicted to drink. I've about given up on 'em and just try now to get as much work out of 'em with as little expense as possible before they run off or die. "I'm sorry for sounding so harsh," he said to Father, who sat and grimly regarded the floor. "But what you got with these Irish is the dead ends of European peasantry." Father stood then and said to Mrs. Wilkinson, who was putting breakfast on the table for us, "Ma'am, if you don't mind, I believe we'll eat with the Negroes in the barn and then rest there until nightfall." "I sense that I've offended you, Mr. Brown," Mr. Wilkinson said. "No, sir. No, you have not," the old man answered. "I am curious, though, as to your reasons for agreeing to aid us in our efforts to carry Negro slaves off to Canada, when you appear to have so little fellow feeling for the poor indentured men and women in your charge here." "Ah," Mr. Wilkinson said brightly. He'd heard this argument before and was prepared, even eager, to answer it. "Slavery is evil. That alone is reason enough for a Christian man to want to aid and abet you. But beyond that, slavery provides the Southerners with an unfair advantage in the labor market." "I see. Well, I am grateful to you for your help, but I do think all the same that we'll take ourselves to the barn now, for I wish to speak with our poor passengers out there who are no doubt feeling anxious about their situation and require from us a bit of reassurance." Evidently pleased that he had made himself understood, if not admired, Mr. Wilkinson escorted us from the room, leading us through a narrow woodshed to the barn. He pointed us towards the hayloft above, where we saw, looking nervously down at us, the faces of the man and woman who had been hidden there the previous night. As soon as Mr. Wilkinson had left us, Mr. Fleet stepped forward in the dark room, smiled up at the young man and woman, and said his own name, then introduced Lyman Epps, Father, and me in that order. "It's safe to come down. Help him down," he said to Lyman, who scrambled up the ladder and assisted first the woman and then the man in descending to the floor of the barn, where we all somberly shook hands. After weeks of running from the hounds of slavery, they were almost too tired to be frightened, but nonetheless their eyes darted warily from one of us to the other, for who knew this could be no more than a white man's clever trap. Then Mrs. Wilkinson entered, carrying a tray of cornbread and eggs and smoked pork and a pitcher of fresh milk. "I'll be sure that no one disturbs you," she said cheerfully, and headed back into the house. Father looked at me, clear irritation on his face. "Disturb us?" he said in a low voice. "These Wilkinsons have it all wrong. They cannot be trusted." I knew that as soon as we got back to North Elba, the old man would cut their link from the chain. The fugitives were named Emma and James Cannon, and they could not have been older than 21, which was unusual. Most escaped slaves we had aided in the past had been closer to middle age, or else were small children in the company of one or both parents. Occasionally, a young man came through unattached, a man defiant from youth, with a runaway cast of mind and 100 lashes on his back to show for it. These two, however, were almost genteel in their ways, shy and decorous, the least likely type of slave to risk flight. But the degradation and the invasion of a person's soul can occur without leaving any visible scars on the body, and that is frequently what happened to the youngest and most delicate of enslaved women and men, as was no doubt the case with the man and woman before us, whose owner, they told us, had been powerful in the Virginia state legislature, a wealthy exporter of tobacco, and a partner in several vast Alabama cotton plantations. They had been married without their owner's consent or knowledge, and when the slave master had begun to express carnal desires towards the young woman, she and her new husband had decided to flee. At nightfall, Mrs. Wilkinson brought food to us a second time, and when we had eaten, Mr. Wilkinson came and cheerfully bade us farewell and led us out of the barn into the dark adjacent woods. Shortly before dawn, we emerged from the deep pine woods on the road just below our farm, where Mr. Fleet parted from us to return to Timbuktu. He would not be joining us for the next stage of our journey, nor would Lyman, for our route would carry us through several villages and a generally more settled region, and we did not want to attract undue attention, as would surely occur if we were in the company of one of Garrett Smith's North Elba niggers. Mr. Fleet seemed almost grateful to be let off, but Lyman was not. "Well, you might wish I was along, Mr. Brown. Some slave catcher come upon you." "You may be sure that Owen and I can ably defend our cargo," Father said. I myself was not so sure. I had not yet fired my gun at another human being, and to my knowledge the old man hadn't either. As we rounded the bend before our house, Father suddenly halted and drew back and hurried us along into the choke cherry bushes by the side of the road. He bade us get down out of sight and silenced us. "We have visitors," he whispered. "2 horses at the front of the house." There was a narrow gully that ran back from the road into a dense thicket of silver birch, and Father instructed the fugitives to hide there. Then he, Lyman, and I approached the house. There were 2 men, one known to us, Caleb Partridge from Keene. The other was a long, leathery fellow with a squint and facial color of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. He wore a holstered Colt Patterson, sort of sidearm one usually associated with a police officer or a Pinkerton agent. He was a man-hunter. As we approached them, Partridge smiled. Father stood a few feet before the visitors, who had gotten slowly to their feet. He cradled his rifle loosely in his arm and said, "Mr. Partridge." "Good morning, Mr. Brown. How do you do? You've been off in Taos, your wife tells us." "Yes, we have. You will introduce your companion to me?" "Been hunting, Mr. Brown?" His teeth were rotted and stained with tobacco. "Yeah, looks like you come up empty." "I do not know you, sir." "Billingsley. Abraham Billingsley of Albany." "I take you to be a bounty hunter, Mr. Billingsley. A slave catcher." "I am an agent hired to return lost or stolen property to its legal and rightful owner. I have a contract," he added, patting his breast pocket. "I do not permit slave catchers to stand on my land, sir. Nor do I permit those who associate with slave catchers to stand on my land," Father said to Partridge. "You will both have to vacate these premises immediately." Stranger took a step forward and smiled and stopped as Lyman and I moved to either side of Father and let our muskets be seen. In a sleepy drawl, the slave catcher said, "But I merely wanted to make some inquiries of you, Mr. Brown." That's all. Your niggers is safe enough. I already seen the wench inside. Her and this one with you, neither of them is lost or stolen. Leastways, not as far as I know. Matter of fact, your good neighbor here, Mr. Partridge, he vouched for them himself. I don't give no trouble to what you call free niggers. I am running you off my property, sir, Father declared. Leave now, or I will shoot you dead. No need to get upset, Partridge said. This here fella come by my house yesterday and requested me to take him over here to North Elba, that's all. He's after some nigger couple from Virginia that killed a man down there and took off to Canada, pretending they was escaped slaves. They got an arrest warrant out for them. He has a contract, not a warrant, Father said. Slave catcher said, Well, I heard there was escaped slaves passing through here, Mr. Brown, and I heard there was a nigger couple staying in your house. Seemed unusual, so I thought I'd just have me a look. I see now they ain't but field niggers, though. The ones I'm looking for is a little yellow gal, dark-skinned boy about 20 years old. House niggers, Brown. Not flat-foot darkies like yours. Father moved in close to both men who backed off from him, for he bore forward with singular purpose and barely contained fury. I do not want to kill you in front of my wife and children. But by God I will. Leave here at once. Partridge stepped quickly away and made for his horse. The slave catcher followed behind with as much leisure as he dared show, and the two mounted their horses and backed them off towards the road. Aim your muskets, boys, the old man said, and we raised our guns. I looked down the barrel at the head of the slave catcher. It felt wonderfully clarifying. We're leaving, Brown, Partridge cried, and he put his horse on the road and kicked it into a gallop and disappeared around a bend. For a few seconds the other man remained and stared hard at Father, as if memorizing his face. Brown, he said, if you try to move the two niggers I'm looking for, I'll have to take 'em from you. Then he turned and rode slowly down the road, passing within 20 feet of the man and woman he wished to capture and return to slavery. Thanks to our encounter with Mr. Billingsley, Father changed his mind and decided to allow Lyman to accompany us to Port Kent. I was glad to have him standing with us this morning, he said to me. I believe he has the courage to shoot a man. I asked Father, what do you think about what Partridge said about the Virginia couple, that they killed a man? He meant their owner, I suppose. Perhaps they did kill a man, their owner. I certainly hope so, he said, his mouth like a crack in a rock. Billingsley is a bounty hunter, not a marshal, and as soon as Partridge shows him the way to Timbuktu, he'll be cut loose, so as not to get any share in the reward. And I don't think Billingsley will dare go up against us alone, he said. When I awoke, it was not yet dark, but peering out the small attic window, I saw that Father and Lyman were outside, hitching the team to the wagon. Even in his 50s, the old man had physical energy exceeding mine, and that of most young men. Lyman seemed naturally to keep pace with the old man, which I admired and somewhat envied, for it made me feel lazy by contrast and ashamed. We escorted Mr. and Mrs. Cannon outside and placed them and their bundles and a basket of food into the back of the wagon, atop the several fleeces and tanned deer hides and pelts that Father had packed there. These he planned to sell in Port Kent, our ostensible reason for traveling to the town. Then, rifle in hand, Lyman climbed into the box, and Father covered the box and all its contents with a canvas sheet, which he drew tight and tied. I climbed up and took the reins. We saw no one along the road to North Elba until we reached the Thompson farm, where Mr. Thompson and several of his sons were crossing the road with their cows. A fervent anti-slavery man, he was the only local man towards whom Father's admiration went without serious provisos attached. Father raised his hand in greeting and touched the rim of his right ear, the common signal for conductors. Mr. Thompson gave the countersign and touched his ear also. "I saw that fellow Partridge from Keene this morning," he said to us. "Yes," Father answered. "He and his friend, a man named Billingsley, paid us a visit as well." Mr. Thompson took a long look at the wagon. "Do you need help?" "No." "Partridge and the bounty hunter went on to the Negro settlement. You know, John, there's plenty of folks hereabouts, folks like Partridge, who'd happily give aid and comfort to a slave catcher for the beauty of $1 or $2. "Where might he light?" Father asked. "Anybody local would tell the man to wait out to Wilmington Notch. So if I was you, I'd keep moving and moving fast when I got to the Notch. It'll be dark by then." "Thank you kindly," Father said. Mr. Thompson nodded and stepped aside. I snapped the reins, and we moved on towards the road that led out of North Elba and passed along the west branch of the Au Sable. Soon it was dark. White Face towered on our left, and below us the river narrowed as the mountains on either side converged at the Notch. For several miles the road was barely wide enough for a single wagon. We had just entered the Notch when Father ordered me to halt the wagon, and he got down and loosened the tarpaulin at the back and folded it over so that Lyman could see out. In a low voice he said to Lyman, "If someone gives chase, Mr. Epps, just fire away." Then he climbed back up beside me, and we continued as before. For a long time no one spoke, but after a while, when we were well clear of the Notch, Father said, "I didn't think Billingsley would want to go up against us alone, but the truth is, he could have done us some damage back there." Father bade me to stop the wagon, and he got down and helped Lyman and our fugitives climb out of the wagon and stretch their limbs and enjoy the cool, fresh air off the lake. We did not speak much to one another, but instead simply gazed at the beauty of the land and sky and water that lay before us. When it was time to move on, we followed the road down to the shore and entered Port Kent. We passed the main dock and several stone warehouses, after which came a row of small boathouses, until we arrived at the last in the row, where we saw a small sign, Captain S.I. Kiefer. A narrow pier ran out a ways into the lake, where a wide-bottomed schooner was tied up. The last leg of our fugitives' journey, their final means of transport to freedom. Father immediately went in search of Captain Kiefer, while Lyman and I stayed with the wagon and our cargo. Lyman laid his rifle in the box of the wagon and stepped behind the boathouse a ways to relieve himself, and I began to explain to our fugitives that we were located on the shore of a lake barely 40 miles south of Canada. This was the last stop on the Underground Railroad, I was saying, when I heard a man's voice from the darkness behind me. "Just stand where you are, Brown, and put your hands on your head," he said calmly. And when I turned, I saw him with his revolver on Lyman. It was Mr. Billingsley, a slave catcher. I slowly lifted my hands and placed them on my head. "You niggers, you move over here by me," the slave catcher said to Mr. and Mrs. Cannon. "And you," he said to Lyman, "you stand by the wagon there with Brown." I saw then that the man was carrying in his other hand a pair of manacles. Extending them to me, he said, Clamp these on to my prisoners, Brown." "No," I said. "I will not do that." He stared at me hard. "Well, you people are crazy as what?" He turned to Lyman. "Here, you do it then. Put these irons on them." He held the instruments out to him. Lyman regarded the manacles coldly. He said, "You the slave catcher, not me." At that instant I saw Father step out of the darkness behind Billingsley. He held his musket at waist level with both hands and had it aimed straight at the small of the man's back. "Put down your gun, Mr. Billingsley," he said in a cold, almost expressionless voice. The slave catcher's eyes went dead, and he inhaled deeply and did as he was told. "Lie on the ground, face down," Father said. Behind Father stood a man whom I took to be Captain Kiefer. There was a note in Father's voice that frightened me, and it surely must have terrified Billingsley. It was the note of a man whose mind was made up, who would not be stopped from completing the terrible action that he had already decided upon. I knew that he had decided to kill the man, and in spite of being frightened by the tone in Father's voice, I was excited by it. Mr. Billingsley got down on his knees and then lay on his stomach, his face pressed against the rocky ground. Father stepped forward and, straddling the man's body, aimed his gun down at his head. Lyman said, "Well, you ain't gonna kill the man, Mr. Brown." "I am," Father said. Captain Kiefer moved forward then and said to Father, "I pray thee, Brown, do not kill him. It is not for thee to execute the man." Lyman looked at me with disbelief, and I caught a glimpse of Mr. and Mrs. Cannon as they backed away from the scene to the front of the wagon and stood by the horses as if preparing for flight. Shoving the stock against his shoulder, Father looked coldly down the barrel. "Slave catcher, I am sending thee straight to hell." I did not dare to rush Father and try to seize his weapon. The gun might go off, or our struggle might give the man the opportunity to escape. But when Kiefer stepped firmly forward as if to grab Father from behind, I spoke at last. "Wait, Father," I cried. "Back off and put the man in his own manacles. Let him wear the manacles he planned to use on the Negroes, and let Lyman do it." Slowly, Father lowered his rifle and backed away. "All right. Lyman, place the chains on him and lock them tight." Lyman reached down and grabbed up one of the two sets of manacles and clamped them onto the white man. Father rolled Billingsley over onto his back, groped through the man's waistcoat pockets until he found the keys, and tossed the keys far out into the cove. He grabbed the second pair of manacles and heaved them into the darkness also, and when they fell into the water there was a loud splash and then silence. A moment passed, and Father said, "Put him into the wagon, Owen." Lyman and I retrieved our guns and together hefted the slave catcher onto his feet and shoved him into the box. While Lyman stood guard over him, I quickly set about removing the hides and pelts, which Captain Kiefer would be selling for us, and placed them inside the boathouse. Father escorted our poor, forlorn, very frightened fugitives directly to the boat, and the captain prepared to set sail at once. "Cast off!" the captain called to Father, who promptly untied the lines from the pilings and tossed them onto the deck. The captain loosed and unfurled a small triangle of sail at the bow, which caught the breeze at once, and the schooner moved abruptly away from the dock. In a few moments the boat had crossed the cove and was rounding the point at the far end, heading for open water. We left Port Kent at once, carrying the slave catcher out of town to the point above the lake where we had rested earlier, and here Father bade me to pull up. He and I climbed down and came around to the rear where Lyman and I got the fellow out. When we climbed into the wagon again and prepared to leave him, slave catcher shot us a puzzled expression, the look of a man who did not understand why we had not killed him. Father said to me, "Drive on quickly, Owen. I cannot stand the sight of the man." I slapped the reins and we left him standing in the middle of the track, his hands clamped behind him in irons. We said nothing to one another for a long while, and then finally Father sighed heavily and said, "I am grateful to thee, Owen." "You are? For what?" "For interfering with me, back there at the lake. I feared you would be angry with me." "No, son, I am in no way angry. I am grateful to you. In saving Billingsley's life, you probably saved my soul from hell. Fact is, I'm not ready to kill a man, Owen." "Not in cold blood," I said. "Yes, and that's the problem. My killing him would have been murder, pure and simple. I have no cold blood, Owen. Not a drop. I must acquire it." I did not know what to say to that. I could not begin to grasp his meaning then, so I said nothing. There would come a time, not many years later, in the smoke and blood of Kansas, with the bodies of men and boys yanked from their warm beds and hacked to death with machetes, lying in chunks steaming like fresh meat all around us in the frozen grass, when I would remember this small conversation, and I would understand it then. One day, several weeks after our misadventure with Billingsley, there appeared up at our farm a United States Marshal from Albany, accompanied by the ever-helpful Mr. Partridge, bearing a warrant for the immediate arrest and return of Emma and James Cannon. The marshal put to Father, as he had to numerous others in the village, pointed questions regarding the whereabouts of the couple. Though his interrogation was clearly based on detailed information provided by Partridge, the marshal appeared to know nothing of our encounter in Port Kent with Billingsley, which was natural. It was not, after all, in the bounty hunter's interest to aid and abet the capture of his prey by a salaried officer of the law, and it was unlikely that he would have reported, even to Mr. Partridge, our having briefly kidnapped him. When Father simply answered that he knew nothing of the Negro couple, there was little the marshal could do but pass north to the next known stop on the railroad to interrogate Captain Kiefer. Up there, most officers of the law had a pretty good idea of who was working on the Underground Railroad and who was not, and, unless prodded by warrants and writs, did little to obstruct them. It was our white neighbors who, when they learned of the warrant for the Cannons, grew frightened and came to Father and spoke angrily against our having escorted murderers north. Father sat on his stool and heard them out. They were a delegation of 3, apparently chosen to represent the views and desires of the entire community. Mr. Thompson was their spokesman. "Helping slaves to escape from slavery is a good thing to do. It's a good thing, upright. But really, John, helping to spirit-known murderers out of the country, well, that's a different matter altogether." All the whites but Father, Mr. Thompson pointed out, had come to North Elba solely to farm and raise their families in peace and security. Even many of the Negroes had come here for that purpose. Now, however, everyone, white and black alike, was being interrogated by a marshal, and bounty hunters like Billingsley and lazy rascals like Partridge had taken to skulking around the place. Let the abolitionist Negroes, Fleet and Epps, conduct escaping slaves on to Canada on their own, Mr. Thompson told Father. "But we whites, John, we should stay clear of it. Completely." Father stood and said, "Gentlemen, you are all my friends, and I would like to put you at your ease, but I cannot just now. I will make my complete answer to your charges and concerns, but I prefer to make it to the entire community come Sunday morning in the church." That Sunday morning we all, including Lyman and Susan Epps, rode into North Elba and marched into the little white Presbyterian church and took our accustomed seats towards the front. We sat in a row with Father on the aisle. There was an unusually large turnout, for this matter had generated considerable heat and feeling in the town. The Reverend Spofford Hall gave out with his usual mechanical invocation, after which the small choir sang the opening hymn with unaccustomed force, I thought, due perhaps to 4 of the 8 being Negroes from the settlement, who must have known there was scheduled in today's ceremonies a thing of particular significance to them. At last the Reverend Hall announced in his high, watery voice, "Today our neighbor, Mr. Brown, will address us." Then he stood down and turned the meeting over to Father. "Good morning, neighbors," the old man said. "I am thinking this rainy, cold morning of old Job, a farmer and stockman like many of us here, a pious man with a large, loving family who, like us, lived in a broad valley surrounded by mountains, where there were wolves and lions and bears, where the cold winds blew in winter, and where beyond the mountains there were enemies lurking who coveted his fields and crops and envied the peacefulness and fruitfulness of his life. Old Job and his family and neighbors nonetheless prospered and thrived until they had become a community in that ancient wilderness, a community much like ours here in our modern American wilderness. Job and his family and friends were, one and all, a consistently upright people. Even God, who loves all men equally, regarded Job as especially admirable. And thus, when Satan sat down on a rock to criticize these poor creatures that were so beloved of God, the Lord singled out Job for special praise. In this story, friends, the key to Satan's motives is that he did not comprehend God's love of mankind, and so Satan spoke to God of mankind as if we were not worthy of God's love. And he said that God should withdraw his love. You remember the story, neighbors. Satan argued that the only reason we humans were obedient to the Lord's commandments was because we expected and often received large rewards for it. And Satan said to the Lord, "You know that fellow Job, the one you're always bragging about, the man you're so high on? Well, he's a hypocrite too, even he. The Lord saith, Ah, yes, my servant Job. But you're wrong. He's the most upright of them all, and he fears me, and he eschews evil." Satan said, "Sure, of course he fears you and eschews evil and makes all the proper observances and so on, but it is not for nothing. Look at the hedge you have built around the man. Look how he is rewarded for it. But just put forth thine hand against him, Lord, and the man will curse thee to thine face," said Satan. And so the Lord gave Satan permission to do with Job as he wished, so long as he did not slay him. All that old Job hath is in thy power, said the Lord to Satan. You remember the story, neighbors. First came the Sabaeans, who slew Job's oxen and his asses, and even put the servants attending them to the sword. And another messenger came in and told him that fire had fallen from the sky and burned up all his sheep. And then 3 bands of Chaldeans fell upon Job's camels, slew the servants attending them, and stole the camels. And then came the worst thing, friends. While Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine together in the house of the eldest son, a great wind smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon them and killed them all. And what did poor Job do in the face of these terrible events? Did he charge the Lord foolishly? Did he rail against God as you or I might have done? No. Job rent his mantle and shaved his head, and then he fell down upon the ground, and friends, he worshipped the Lord. Naked came I out of my mother's womb, he said, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This, neighbors, was no hypocrite. But Satan wasn't satisfied yet. He hath his life still, Satan pointed out to the Lord. But just put forth thy hand now and touch his bone, and touch his flesh, and Job will curse thee to thy face. The Lord said, Go on, try him. So Satan went forth, and he smote old Job with sore boils from his foot to his crown. The poor man could only sit in agony among ashes, scraping his inflamed flesh with a potsherd. Such a figure of pathos and ruination was he, that even his wife came out and said to him, Husband, curse God and die. Harsh words, neighbor, are they not? But wise old Job, he said to his wife, Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and not evil also? Then from the town came Job's 3 friends to comfort and grieve with him. Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar were their names. Old Eliphaz, a sensible man, we would say, if he came among us today in North Elba, argued that Job must have somehow offended God. Happy is the man, reasoned the Temanite, whom God correcteth. Cheer up, he told Job. You are being chastised by the Father for your failings. Oh, if only that were the case, was Job's answer. And so Bildad the Shuhite spoke. Surely, friend Job, surely God would not cast away a perfect man, he said, and neither will he keep an evildoer. You cannot be one, so you must perforce be the other. But Job cried, No, 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 1,000 times no. If I justify myself to the Lord, mine own mouth shall condemn me. If I say I am perfect, he shall prove me perverse. The Lord destroyeth the perfect and the wicked alike. Then Zophar the Naamathite gave it a try. You must be lying, he said as kindly as he could. You say to us that thou art clean in the Lord's eyes. Well, Job, old friend, that cannot be, else you would not be in such a catastrophic condition. So confess, my brother, and then the Lord will reward thee. And Job said to Zophar, No, 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 look around, you fool. Everywhere the tabernacles are full of robbers, and they prosper. Everywhere those who provoke God are secure. Therefore you, my friends and neighbors, saith Job to Zophar, Bildad, and Eliphaz, you are all physicians of no value. As for me, Job said, and here I come to the point of my preachment to you, Job said, "Though the Lord slay me, yet will I trust him, and will maintain mine own ways before him."